Hot rods zoomed onto the front pages of American newspapers in the 1950s as speed-crazed teenagers turned streets into impromptu racetracks. We'll see what happened when the public, the police, and the press launched a campaign to stomp out this menace. It takes us back to the start of the baby-booming youth culture and rockets us forward as hot rodders push the limits of speed. Hot rodding has spawned a multi-billion-dollar industry of sanctioned drag racing, aftermarket car parts and accessories, and specialty car builders who create high-dollar custom cars for people with a need for speed. It's become an ingrained part of American culture that has attracted fans all over the world. Hot rodding, like surfing, skateboarding, and so many other American cultural phenomena, got its start in California. It started in the late 1920s as automotive speed enthusiasts began to race on the dry lake beds of Southern California's high desert.
We had a unique feature in Southern California. There were several areas where old lakes had dried up and left an alkaline hard surface on them.
These dry lake beds were about a 2-hour drive east of Los Angeles. This was close enough to make weekend speed trials accessible for local amateur racers.
There was El Mirage and Muroc in particular, where the young men, it was close enough to Los Angeles, they could drive out there, strip their cars down, race them, and then drive them home, hopefully. But it was a legal testing bed. And you know, the fellows just went out to see how fast they could go.
The first cars to race at the lakes were mostly stripped-down Model Ts. These cars were inexpensive, plentiful, and could be easily modified to go fast.
Actually, my first Model T that I bought cost me $4. I bought it in a local used car lot, and it didn't have any tires on it, but we towed it home, and I started from there to build it into my own personal version of a street rod.
This was an underground endeavor that relied on the native intelligence and resourcefulness of a legion of young, speed-crazed backyard tinkerers.
Well, most of them were just kids that wanted to work on a car, had some mechanical ability, and would go to the junkyard and find parts that would make their own car go a little faster.
I think the first thing that we did with the Model T was to manage to get some tires for it, and about the next thing was to take off the fenders and running boards.
The clean, fenderless look became the trademark of a hot rod. The cars appeared ready to race.
That made it look like something a little different right away. As soon as the wheels were exposed, it was pretty much a hot rod by that time.
Like scientists, they relied on trial and error experiments to prove their speed theories. The lake beds were their laboratories, and by the early 30s, their souped-up Model Ts were attaining speeds in excess of 100 miles per hour. More than double a stock Model T's 45 mile per hour upper limit. The price of entry into this speed academy was fairly low. If you had a few dollars, the inclination to scour a local junkyard for parts, and the enthusiasm to transform some abandoned hulk into a racer, you were in.
There was a lot of research and development, if you might say, going on in junkyards, because it's amazing. You could find axles and heads and pistons that would be interchangeable with another engine to make your car go faster.
This was an era when your basic backyard guy was convinced he could build a better looking, faster car than Detroit, and hot rodders went out and proved it.
The scene at the dry lakes continued to grow, but growth had its downside.
As it became more popular and more cars ran up there, it got a little dangerous because sometimes, unfortunately, the guys would run into each other.
It was a situation where if you're out in front, you could see. If you were not out in front, you were just in a whirl of dust.
To clear the dust, 5 Los Angeles hot rod clubs organized the Southern California Timing Association, the SCTA, in 1937. The first item on their agenda was to bring order to the chaos. The clubs worked out racing rules that made it safer to run at the lakes. The rules came as speeds were starting to increase dramatically. This was partly due to the introduction of Ford's flathead V8 engine in 1932. It replaced the Model T as the car platform du jour.
It's what everybody wanted. Some of the best early hot rods were 32 Fords.
The 1932 Ford Roadster, or Deuce, with a modified flathead V8, became the poster child for hot rodding. Stripping off the fenders, raking the windshield and putting fat tires on the back and the little tires on the front was good for racing, and it looked great.
Gradually, the 32 Roadster finally became the generic hot rod. There's no question about that, and today it's still that way.
The lakes continued to attract bigger crowds, but the fun was about to stop. The world was thrown into war, and the young racers turned their attention to the fight. Many of them ended up applying their mechanical skills to fixing jeeps, tanks, and airplanes during the war. All skills that they could use once they returned home. The pent-up need for speed propelled the returning GIs to head for the lakes when they were discharged. They started to try things they'd been thinking about while in the service.
Well, I think a lot of the technology that came out of World War II added a lot to hot rodding. And I think, you know, a great part of that was centered here in Southern California.
During the war, an awful lot of airplane mechanics were from Southern California. We ran into each other wherever we were. And I don't know, we were just mechanically oriented out here for some reason.
Alex Exidius and his fellow Lakesters had spread the word about the glories of hot rodding to their fellow soldiers while in the service. The stories of their racing exploits planted the seeds of enthusiasm for hot rodding around the country.
At the end of World War II, there certainly was a lot more interest in all parts of the countries in this type of activity because the experience had been shared in military services and so forth.
The Southern California guys spread that word, of course. In the barracks at night, they would show pictures of their roadsters and stuff. And after the war, though, that's when it really started. Big time after the war. Thousands of young men were getting out of the service, some with mustering out pay, all of them with a big ambition to get going on their cars.
Not all the new racers wanted to make the trek to the dry lakes. They were happy to cruise the streets and hang out at those quintessential Southern California gathering spots, the drive-ins.
The Tiny Nailers, the Mells, you know, all those drive-ins were a meeting place. Just, I suppose, in the Midwest and the East, you know, you had the root beer stands and the Foster's Freeze and so forth, but all those places were places that young people could go. They were, you know, they could legally buy the drink. They could drive their cars there, show them off, and it was just kind of the meeting place.
Come on, Jack, jump in. We're going down for a mall.
Oh, yeah. In addition to going fast, you also had a great deal of pride in the appearance of your car. You did a lot of stuff for appearance only, and the drive-in was the place to show the car off and enjoy that part of hot rodding.
As soon as you invite the gals in and you get a bunch of people together, then it's, you know, who has the fastest car. And I think high school, probably a lot of races came out of high school too. I mean, whenever you get the guys together, and hot rods are hot, you know, you want to enjoy them.
Boy, will you look at the Speed King. Come on, Jay, let's have some fun with him.
Most of them were just there for the show and for the fun of being together, but no, there were definitely races developed out of the drive-in. That was a good spot to go and find somebody that you wanted to race.
Certain drive-ins were close to streets that could serve as impromptu racetracks. Ideally, they were away from congested areas, something still easy to find in the early 50s.
Well, when you talk to guys who drove fast on the streets in that era, they remind you that there weren't a lot of neighbors. These long boulevards were nearly deserted, and some of the ones in what now are inner Los Angeles suburbs, like a Culver City, in those days it was the boonies. And there wasn't anybody on the road. It was relatively safe, and they could test their cars.
Most people weren't bothered by the occasional speed duels, but there were accidents and even deaths. Eventually, the police, the press, the public, and the politicians began to crack down on street racing.
They would have raids out in Sepulveda where they would block off both ends of the highway, and the kids would just dash out through the fields and everything to try to get away. And it became quite common to have these roadblocks and things at favorite racing areas.
Hot rodding was getting a bad name. It was clear something had to be done. Robert Peterson, a young man with the necessary PR skills and vision to see how to turn things around, was also interested in hot rodding. Talking to people at car shows and at the dry lakes convinced him that hot rodding needed a newsletter or magazine.
Oh, I'd been going to the lakes, and of course my dad was a mechanic. I grew up in a garage, and I was out racing with the guys, and we all kept talking about we really need a magazine, something where the people can talk to each other.
For help and advice, he turned to a friend's father who published a magazine. The result, Hot Rod Magazine, hit the newsstands in 1947.
That gave us an opportunity to extend the exposure of what we were doing into other parts of the country. We had a platform now that would reach hot rod enthusiasts all over the country.
Some thought using the name Hot Rod with its outlaw street gang connotations was risky.
Well, hot rod, we discussed that many times, whether that was the name to use, but we always came back to it.
A lot of us didn't even like the name hot rod because it was sort of dreamed up by the newspapers to mean car racing on the streets and stuff. So we didn't particularly like it, but eventually something had to be done, and you know, nobody wanted to call it Gow Job Magazine or something, so hot rod became the generic term.
Hot Rod took off from its first issue. The magazine became a platform from which Peterson and editor Wally Parks could reach the whole country. The magazine helped the sport grow. It reached the older hot rodders and a new group of readers, the post-war teenager. These kids didn't want to be seen in Dad's dowdy old sedan. They wanted to soup up their own cars. Some of the new converts started to join in the street racing. The public clamor increased. It was time for someone to find a way to safely harness the urge to go fast.
Quite a few people were very down on hot rods, and they were all trying to ban hot rods, do what they could to stop them. And I guess you can't blame some. The Highway Patrol had quite a few problems.
Let's head for Sepulveda.
Hollywood wasn't worried about the recklessness of youth. It provided perfect fodder for mindless exploitation films that were designed for date-night viewing at the drive-ins.
Drag Strip Girl, a teenage tantalizer with a chassis that'll make every man's motor roar.
You gonna come to my party, Don?
I get a little dizzy trying to remember which is my turn and which is Fred's.
Oh, I like you both. Is that a crime?
Here's your girl, Fred. I just borrowed her for a few minutes.
Girls too fast becoming women. Boys who are almost men, teasing death to win the favors of Drag Strip Girl.
Wally Parks and Peterson worked to change the image of hot rodding. They reached out to the clubs.
The group that was the SCTA realized that they've got to do something to go out here and create a better public image, so they organized not only the Dry Lakes events to run more safely and more efficiently, but they joined, their members joined the National Safety Council en masse and pledged that they would become safer drivers on the street and try to influence their friends to do likewise.
The initial effort helped, but it would take much more to channel the hot rod racing energy into something positive. Parks and others slowly hit on an idea. Why not encourage officially sanctioned races in every community across the country? The National Hot Rod Association, the NHRA, was born. One of its first tasks was to find venues for its races. They noticed there were a lot of airstrips around the country that had been abandoned after the war. These seemed to be perfect for a speed event they soon called drag racing. The idea sounded like a winner right from the start.
Drag racing was just perfect because it was local. Most of them were, you know, like the first one was right here in Santa Ana and then in Pomona. And they were short quarter-mile courses. You could drive your car out there. It wouldn't get all trashed driving out. It wasn't like you were running it flat out for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 miles. So it was a quarter-mile burst. And most people wanted to see by a quarter of a mile who had the fastest car. And that kind of, you know, satisfied everybody's need for speed.
The quarter-mile length of the drag strip came about because that was the length of road needed to accelerate and safely stop.
We sat down one time and I had a mathematician figure how fast a hot rod could go, theoretically by the coefficient of the drag on the tires and the speed of the engine and the power.
And in those tests, and those experiments with lots of different types of cars, well, we found that a quarter mile was about the farthest distance you could go and still be safe.
Initially, the cars that showed up to race at the drags were the same ones that were being driven at the lakes or on the streets.
When I was growing up, back in the 50s, I mean, we'd all take our cars, our daily ride to the drag races. We'd pull off the hubcaps, uncork, the exhaust, and run it, and then drive home. But as I say, the guys that were more serious about it started building cars just for drag racing, and that's where it kind of developed into, dragsters.
By 1950, hot rodders were running stripped-down vehicles that were more full-time dragsters than daily driving street rods. The Bug is the forerunner of the modern dragster. Its driver, Dick Craft, piloted his bare-bones engine on rails to 116 miles per hour. By the early 1960s, the top fuel dragsters were setting unbelievable records. On August 1st, 1964, Big Daddy, Don Garlitz, broke the 200-mile-per-hour barrier in a quarter mile. The fans loved it. Peterson, Parks, and others had won. They'd lured the street racers to the drag strips and calmed down the public. However, things were changing. The traditional hot rod was no longer able to thumb its nose at Detroit's stodgy behemoths. Starting with the V8-powered 55 Chevy and on through the GTO, the GT350 Mustangs, and all the muscle cars, hot rodders had choices like they'd never dreamed possible. There was no longer a need to build your own car. You could order a superfast car from a dealer.
They didn't care if it was a 55 Chevy or a 57 Chevy or a Mopar or a GTO. Those cars just were quick.
I mean, these were right out of the box. These were 13 and a half second cars. I mean, they could do 100 and a quarter, and you could tweak them a little bit, and they'd go even better. And you could buy them for under $4,000. So there was really no contest. I mean, guys are looking and saying, I want a fast car, I can buy one now.
The traditional hot rod world was somewhat adrift. Some turned to custom cars. These cars caught the attention of writers like Tom Wolfe, who dubbed them the candy-colored, tangerine flake, streamlined babies. While pundits and television shows loved the cars, many hot rod purists had no use for the customs.
These weren't hot rods, in my opinion. Custom cars were just like a whole nother diversion. I think they kind of split at that point. And hot rodding was more, high performance. Even though some of the customs had high performance engines, they weren't really built to go. They were built to show.
Mass-produced high-performance cars, the dalliance with custom cars, then gas shortages, combined with fuel economy and environmental regulations, changed the automotive landscape by the 1970s. All this slowed the growth, but never really diminished the spirit that gave hot rodding its heart. As the boomers aged, they began to long for simpler times and search out the cars they admired when they were young. One of the early leaders of the hot rod resurgence was Pete Shapouris, a hot rod builder who turned heads with unique designs and high-quality craftsmanship.
Looks pretty cool.
I'm basically a car builder. I mean, if you want to know what I do, I'm a really good heliarc welder. I'm a welder. I like to create things and fabricate, and I was blessed with having a lot of really good friends that I hung out with that were able to take that need for speed and turn it into a business.
Shapouris was able to turn his need for speed into a business that attracts rock stars like Billy F. Gibbons of ZZ Top, classic car collectors like Bruce Meyer, and a number of well-heeled baby boomers who want the right hot rod for their weekend cruise.
They're doctors by now, or they're entrepreneurial, or even if they've had a really good job at Lockheed and they graduated up the ladder, their kids are out of college, they had a 40 Ford when they were a kid in high school, and they're coming in here looking for a car, and if the car's $100,000, that's fine. You know, that's the way it works.
Here are guys in their 50s who can have what they really wanted when they were 17 years old, and they're going after it. They're either restoring old cars or they're building new cars from scratch.
Hot rodding has even reached into the upper realms of the automotive world. Chrysler's former vice president of design, Tom Gale, is an avid fan.
I can remember when I was a young man, I wanted to buy a chopped and channeled 33 coupe. My dad just didn't have any enthusiasm for this at all. And I think that's probably the one thing that kept that driving passion, because I always said, someday I'm going to do that. And this is really that culmination, or a culmination of that effort.
This interest has pumped new life into hot rodding. Weekend rallies, historic races at the dry lakes, and car shows have helped to spread the enthusiasm around the world. People like Bruce Meyer, who'd collected classic cars like Packards and Mercedes, became interested in hot rods. Meyer was determined to see these recognized at the most exclusive classic car event in the world, the annual Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance, held near Carmel, California. This was not typical hot rod territory. This was where, Jay Leno joked, the billionaires came to compete with the millionaires over who had the most important car. Myers was persistent and convinced the organizers that their champagne sipping would not be interrupted by hooligans. They invited 8 historically significant hot rods to compete for the honor of winning a trophy at Pebble Beach.
And it was hugely successful, and I congratulate them for their open-mindedness. And I think it really, again, just moves hot rods one step closer into, acceptance, so to speak.
Meyer entered the Doane Spencer Roadster, restored by Shapouris, and asked him to come along.
We were treated tremendously well by all of it. It was awesome. It was just really, really cool. We had the Packard guys came over and they were asking me about the paint job on our car. At first I thought they were shining me on. I thought they were really interested because their cars didn't look as good as this car did.
It appeared that the hot rod's outlaw days were over. It had broken into the very center of the core of civility, but it hadn't lost its streetwise charm and allure.
Anything that can bring specialness, anything that can bring a unique quality to our sense of living, our day-to-day life is embraceable. And I think hot rodding is just one great way to get it real, real quick.
The hot rod to me, middle of the day, away from it all, going up Highway 5, running with the Porsches, was really a kick in the ass. I loved it. It's better than therapy.
There is something special about these American icons that appeals to everyone.
I have Ferraris and Bentleys and other things too, but I myself, I'm working on building a 32 Roadster.
I just am so grateful for the fact that I somehow stumbled into this thing, and that even more so I stayed with it and helped to build it to where it is today.
Hot rodding has become an ingrained part of the American culture. It's inspired clothing designs, television shows, movies, and songs. It's launched an industry estimated to generate more than $25 billion a year. All this from a few kids who had a need for speed.